Sponsored by Rina Motti Schwartz in memory of her father Yerachmiel ben Yosef Wolf. The neshama should have an aliyah as a Hashem. One of the difficulties that arises when we contemplate yet again the Chet Meraglim, a difficult Chet, which for us is hard to understand exactly what went wrong, what happened. So the question always is, when exactly did this transformation of the Meraglim occur? It seems that these Meraglim were the head of the nation. They were the Gedolei Hadar. And in fact, Rashi seems clear to indicate that that was the case, that in fact they were Anoshim. We don't refer to people as Anoshim unless they are the Lashon Chashivas. But Oyusa Shah, Rashi tells us, Hayu Ksherim. These were great people. Yet we know that Rashi brings quite a little bit later in the Parsha. The Torah tells us, Vayelchu Vayavoyu El Moshe. They come to Moshe ve'el Aaron. Rashi says, Vayelchu vayavo. They go and they come. It's a strange language. They go and they come. Says Rashi, Mahu vayelchu. What does it mean, vayelchu? Lahakish halichosan libiyosan. Ma biyosan be'etzara. Af halichosan be'etzara. Just like they came back to Moshe and Aaron be'etzara, and they had bad intentions to speak negatively about Eretz Yisrael. So it wasn't only when they came, Vayelchu Vayavoyu. The Torah says, realize that this was already the intent. They left Be'etzara as well. So many of the Mefarshim are bothered. I don't understand. Rashi, you told me, Shlach Lecha Anoshim V'lamed Shehem Kisherim. These were good people. They were the Gedolei Hadar, the finest men that Moshe Rabbeinu could find. Yet, on the other hand, you tell me, Vayelchu Vayavoyu. When they went, they already went with a negative intention. So how are we supposed to understand when exactly did this transformation take place? So the Marsha and the Stiplers seem to assume that in fact it happened immediately. When they were originally chosen, these were the finest people. These were people that were ksherim, anoshim ksherim. Says the Stipler guy. But when they were chosen, at that moment, nichnisa bahem ruach gaiva. At that moment, they were thought that the Moshe Rabbeinu was hiring them as adjusters, hiring them to assess what the situation is. They didn't realize Moshe Rabbeinu didn't need their assessment. V'nira devadai, says the Stipler, b'shal shenivcharu, at the moment they were chosen, ksherim hayu, ve'aminu b'Hashem yisbarach, they believed in the Rebbeinu Shalom and everything the Rebbeinu Shalom was promising. Ach miyad la'achar shenivcharu, the moment they were chosen, bo lechlal gaiva v'nidme lehem shem nivcharu loy b'tur shluchim be'alma l'saper mashiru, not only as messengers to relay what they see, ele b'tur dayanim u'poiskim, let us assess what the situation is, and from that moment, the moment of their being chosen, that's when everything began to crumble. So yes, when Moshe Rabbeinu chose them, they were anoshim ksherim. The next minute, then already nichnasa behem ruach gaiva, says the Stipler, and they become people who have an eitza ra'a vayelchu vayavo. But to understand this, I think we have to probe a little bit deeper. What exactly occurred? What exactly are Chazal telling us? Vayelchu vayavoyu, if they went with a bad intent, so l'chaora, these weren't the finest of people. How are we supposed to understand this on a deeper level? So I think to understand it on a deeper level, we have to understand how the Torah tells it to us. First of all, if you're going to tell us that these people were leaving be'etza she'ena hagenis, they left with a bad and ill intent. From the get-go, their intent was to speak negatively about Eretz Yisrael. So tell me right at the beginning. Tell me before they leave, when they go out to the, right, it says Vayalu Vayasuru, when they go out to spy, allude to the fact that they were going with a negative intent. But yet, the Torah doesn't tell it to us until they come back and speak to Moshe Rabbeinu. And furthermore, why is the Torah expressing this to us with the lashon of Vayelchu Vayavayu? We always have to understand that within the kli, so to speak, the mechanism that the Torah uses to express a certain idea could often be very instructive in terms of understanding the idea. So why is the status, the spiritual status of the Meraglim alluded to in this phrase, Vayelchu Vayavohu, that we only know that they went originally with ill intent, only once they come back, and we know that they came back with bad intent. So to understand this, we have to take a step back. Let's take a step back and understand review some of the concepts we've discussed in the past, to understand what exactly was the chait of the Meraglim. What did they do wrong? We all know the questions. They presumably did exactly what they were asked to do. Kal Yisrael asked to send messengers. Moshe Rabbeinu, perhaps he didn't want to, but at the end of the day, he acquiesced. We're sending Meraglim. You're sending Meraglim, so then you're obviously okay with the notion that people are going to go out and spy and see what's going to be, and that's all they did. All they did was report their findings, which was exactly their mission. What was so negative about what the Meraglim did? So to understand this, really the best indication comes from the idea of the Ksava Kabbalah. The Ksava Kabbalah says, if you will notice, take a look at the lashon of the psukim. If you take a look at the language of the psukim, you will notice certainly that although we call these people the Meraglim, the Torah in this week's parsha never refers to them as Meraglim. The Torah doesn't use the lashon, doesn't use the language of Meraglim. What does the Torah use? What language? Vayalu vayosuru. It's not until later in the Torah where the Torah begins in Sefer Devarim, the Torah is relaying the story of the Meraglim, and there for the first time the Torah uses the lashon of Vayiraglu oisa. They spied out the land. Says the Ksava Kabbalah. Are we referring to them as Meraglim? So then in Parsha and Sefer Bamidbar also referred to them as Meraglim. What's going on? Why in Sefer Bamidbar we have nothing to do with Meraglim? We don't see the word Meraglim. In Sefer Devarim, then the Torah all of a sudden says Vayiraglu. And he explains very, very clearly that the word Vayasuru and the word Vayiraglu mean two totally separate things. The word Vayasuru means a person who's going and looking to be Mevakesh Toiv, going to look and find the good. A person who's being meragel is going to look for the weakness of the land. Yevakesh es hara, says the Ksava Kabbalah. Like we know from Yosef, he accuses his brother, Meraglim atem lir'ois es ervas ha'aretz. Meragel, by definition, as we know, meragel, a person who is going to find the word, to see a weak spot, to see a negative attribute. Meragel definitionally means a person going with the eyes to see the negative. Vayosuru is the opposite. The same act. I'm going in, but I'm going in not to see the negative, I'm going to see the positive. Vayosuru, I go into a museum to see the unbelievable things of a museum. Vayiraglu, that's when I'm going in to see the negative. Says the Ksava Kabbalah, that was the chait of the Meraglim. There is always in any situation the ability to see good and the ability to see bad. The Meraglim went mitchila. They went mitchila with the mindset to see bad. And if you want to see bad, you will no doubt see bad. This is what the Chafetz Chaim says was at the root of the chait of the Meraglim. At the root of the chait of the Meraglim, says the Chafetz Chaim, was this willingness or this desire to see the poor aspects of Eretz Yisrael. Says the Chafetz Chaim in Shmiras HaLashon, the chait of Meraglim hu bazeh sheyu yecholim lirois toiv al haaretz. They could have seen the positive. V'heim ra'u rak es hatzad hara. All they saw was the negative. V'im haya b'hem midas ayin toiva. If they would have had different glasses on, b'chol davar hayu royim es hatzad hatoiv. Aval mikevan shelo hayu b'hem midas zu shal ayin toiva ra'u rak es hatzad hara. He quotes from the Tzavav Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol. Fascinating. The Chazal bring the following mashal. B'ni don't be like a fly when it comes to the When it comes to your friends, what your friends are lacking. What does a fly do? It leaves the healthy parts of the body and begins to pluck away at a wound, at an unhealthy part of the skin. A person, when looking at anyone else, could decide to focus on the positive, or he could decide to focus on the negative. The chait of Lashon Hara says, the Chofetz Chaim comes from the fact that a person is not willing to focus on the positive, he's rather focusing on the negative. And why does that happen, explains the Chofetz Chaim? The Torah tells us, Ubidavar hazeh einchem ma'aminim ba'Hashem Elokeichem. You didn't believe? They believed in the Rebbeinu Shalom. Where's the lack of Amunah? The lack of Amunah is because the Rebbeinu Shalom is telling you it's good. You could go and find good. If the Rebbeinu Shalom says it's good, there's certainly good for you to set your eyes on, but you refuse to look at the good and instead you focus on the bad. Vayim asu be'eretz chemda. What does it mean, Vayim asu? They were disgusted be'eretz chemda. They decided to focus on the negative aspects of Eretz Yisrael. In fact, Reb Chaim Shmuel Levitz has a fantastic idea when it comes to this concept. Once we've established quite clearly from the very language of the psukim that a person who is going to speak Lashon Hara, the chait is because the person is focusing on the negative, like that zvuv who tries to find the wound in the person's skin rather than focusing on the positive. Reb Chaim Shmuel Levitz says now we could understand a very, very interesting Maimer Chazal, a very interesting pshat in the pasuk itself. Says Reb Chaim Shmuel Levitz, unbelievable. B'mispar hayomim asher tartem es ha'oretz arba'im yoim lashana tisu es avoneisechem arba'im shana. Klal Yisrael were punished for 40 years. They stayed in the Midbar. Why? Because of the 40 days that the Meraglim went out. Chaim Shmuel Levitz famously has, I don't understand. They spoke one day Lashon Hara. The 40 days of spying, why are they punished for every day of 40 days of spying? So very often we say, yeah, because those days they were preparing to do the Isser. But if you take a look at the language of the Rishonim, it sounds like what the Rishonim are telling us is something specific to Lashon Hara. Not when it comes to every Isser, the preparation for the Isser is considered to be the Chay. But a new concept that perhaps we don't necessarily think about. Lashon Hara, says the Ramah, is not only an Aveira B'dibur. The Ramah writes in Teres Ha'oila, Lashon Hara is not an Aveira B'dibur. Lashon Hara is an Aveira B'machshava. What that means is that Lashon Hara is not only speaking negatively about someone, but Lashon Hara is even thinking negatively about someone. Says the Ramah in Teres Ha'oila, Pechela Gimel Perek Samachez Brop Rav Eli Baruch Finkel De Lashon Hara Hu B'maisa U B'machshava. It's not only a chait when I go speaking, even thinking negatively about the person, thinking negatively about the entity, about the institution, that is nichlal in the chait of Lashon Hara. The Sefer Chassidim writes it as well. Baal Machshava Ra. You want to know what an over Lashon Hara is Baal Machshava Ra. Shegam Zeh Bichlal Isra Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara doesn't begin with the negative talking. It ends with the negative speech. Lashon Hara began with the machshava ra'ah, when I began thinking negatively, because it's that machshava ra'ah that is ultimately going to decide how you speak. Lashon Hara is about perceiving something. Do I perceive it in a positive light, or do I perceive it in a negative light? I don't have to go and speak about it to be over Lashon Hara. The moment I looked at someone and rather than seeing their positive qualities, I saw their negative qualities, says the Ramah, at that moment I was already to a certain degree negligent in the Isser of Lashon Hara. Once I viewed them in a negative light and I wasn't able to focus on the positive aspects, I was only able to focus on the negative aspects, at that moment already I was nichnas into the Aveira of Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is never, is over, a person's over b'machshava ubedibur, with thought alone. And therefore, says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, the Meraglim weren't over one day of Lashon Hara. They were over 40 days of Lashon Hara. Because every time they saw Eretz Yisrael in a negative light, that was part of the Chet of Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is not an Aveira of Dibur. Lashon Hara is an Aveira of Machshava. Of course, it climaxes with Dibur. But in seeing the world in its negative, focusing on the negative aspect of things, that is the Chet of Lashon Hara, and in fact the Meraglim did that for 40 days. Based on this, now we could come back to the beginning of our question, and the beginning of the parsha, and answer our question, try to understand what the Stipler, what the Maharsha is saying. We asked the Stira, were these people good people? Were they Anoshim Ksherim? Or were they Risha'im? Vayelchu Vayavoyu. So he said, why does the Torah wait until they come back? Why does the Torah communicate this to me, Vayelchu Vayavoyu? What the Torah is telling me is as follows. When they left, from the perspective of anyone who observed them, these were Anoshim Ksherim. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were tzaddikim. They were great people that hadn't done anything wrong. It was only once they came back and they spoke the Lashon Hara, that was Igloyi Milsa Lemafreya, that they were perceiving things incorrectly. You could only speak Lashon Hara, says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, says the Chafetz Chaim, says the Rabbeinu Yoina and Shari Tshuva. You could only speak Lashon Hara if your mindset is incorrect, if your focus is wrong, if you're glad the wrong glasses are on, if you're, rather than using your Ayin Tova, you're using your Ayin Ra. So when a person speaks Lashon Hara, it's not merely the moment that they're speaking Lashon Hara, but it's an indication that at the time when they were observing, the time when they were perceiving, they were in an incorrect mode of thinking. That's when the Aveira happened. So when they come back, it's not just now we see that these are negative people. But the Torah tells us, Vayelchu Vayavoyu, when they came back to Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayelchu Vayavoyu, we see that when they left to begin with, they weren't Risham yet. But when they left with a mindset, a negative mindset, where they're going to focus on the negative. And that's what this stipler means. When did that transition happen? When did that transformation happen? The moment they were chosen, it was transformed. They were still Anoshim Ksherim, but Vayelchu Vayovo. Once they come back, we see you could only speak this way if you have a certain mindset. You could only speak this way if you wasn't Vayalu Vayasuru, but rather it was Vayiraglu Es Haaretz. It's only possible to be over the Isser of Lashon Hara b'dibur if you were already over the Isser of Lashon Hara b'machshava. And therefore the Torah says, Vayelchu Vayavo. The Torah doesn't tell us when they went. When they went, nothing was detectable. You wouldn't be able to notice a thing. The Torah tells us when they came back, it became clear that even when they had gone with the wrong frame of mind. And that was the beginning of the end. When a person goes with the frame of mind to see the negative, they will always see the negative. If a person wants to see the negative in another person, it could be your best friend, it could be your spouse, it could be your child, it could be your parent. If you're looking for the negative, you will find negative. If you're looking for the positive, you will find positive. When we meet other people, are we vayasuru or are we Vayiraglu? Makes all the difference in the world. Sometimes we may only know once the dibur comes, but the dibur is not the isser. The dibur is reflective of the fact that the entire machshava, the entire perspective, the entire frame of mind was incorrect. That's what happens with the Meraglim. Even though when they go, they are still the Gedolei Hador. When they come back, Vayavo, we see that when Vayelchu, when they left, they were already in the incorrect frame of mind. They were already being Meragel rather than Vayasuru. I wish you all a good night. Reb Chananya ben Akash